Millionaire fires elderly employee from his company, but discovers something that changes both their lives forever. Eleanor had worked at Grantham Industries for nearly 4 decades, her presence as constant as the steady ticking of the office clocks. At 74, she was a quiet, reliable figure, known for her loyalty and dedication. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. She was the one who stayed late to organize files, who knew every detail of the company's history, and who genuinely cared about the people around her. But times had changed, and her once thriving workplace was now overshadowed by new management. The young, ambitious CEO, Daniel Grantham, had recently taken over his father's legacy. To him, Eleanor was just another outdated employee from a bygone era. Daniel had a vision, one of innovation, efficiency, and modernization. He was eager to cut costs, streamline processes, and infuse new talent into the company. His father had passed away the year before, leaving him in control, and with it came a determination to build something grander than his father had ever envisioned. So, when he received reports that Eleanor's productivity had declined, he felt that letting her go was a necessary step. "It's time for fresh energy here," he explained to his executive team. The decision was swift and, he believed, necessary. Eleanor sensed the change in atmosphere as soon as Daniel took charge. She heard rumors of restructuring and whispers of her name in hushed conversations. She clung to the hope that her loyalty and hard work would count for something, but deep down, she feared that her years of dedication were slipping into obscurity. It pained her to think that she might be discarded, reduced to a line in a report. But she stayed silent, focusing on her tasks, each day a reminder of the years she'd given to this place and the people she cherished. The day came sooner than she anticipated. Sitting in a cold conference room, she listened as Daniel informed her of her termination. His words were precise, practiced, almost clinical. "Thank you for your years of service, Eleanor," he said, barely making eye contact. "But we need to move in a different direction." The words stung, each one hitting her with a cold finality. She nodded, holding back tears, and gathered her things without a word. She didn't want him to see her pain, her humiliation, the ache of feeling replaceable after all these years. As she left the building for the last time, Eleanor felt an emptiness she couldn't describe. It wasn't just a job she was leaving behind, it was a lifetime. Every inch of that office held memories, celebrations, challenges, friendships, and laughter. It had become more than just a place to work, it had been her second home. The sudden loss of it all weighed heavily on her heart, and with each step, she felt as though a part of her was being left behind, abandoned in the sterile hallways of Grantham Industries. Meanwhile, Daniel hardly gave her departure a second thought. To him, she was a necessary sacrifice, a small part of his grand vision for the future. He was focused on his ambitious plans, determined to take Grantham Industries to new heights. Yet, despite his confidence, a sense of unease gnawed at him. There was something about Eleanor's expression as she left that lingered in his mind, an unspoken sorrow that he couldn't quite shake. He pushed the thought away, dismissing it as a byproduct of a difficult decision. Eleanor returned to her modest home, her heart heavy with grief. She sat in her small living room, surrounded by familiar items, yet everything felt foreign. The silence pressed down on her, amplifying the emptiness she felt. She had never married, never had children. Her life had been her work, her colleagues her family. Now, stripped of her purpose, she struggled to imagine a future without Grantham Industries. Her mind raced with questions, fears, and doubts, all swirling together into a storm of sadness. Days passed in a blur, and Eleanor found herself slipping into despair. She spent her time wandering through old photographs, mementos of a life she had dedicated to others. Each image was a reminder of friendships forged and memories made within the walls of Grantham Industries. She felt isolated, forgotten, and struggled to hold on to a sense of identity without her work. It was as though her very existence had been tied to the company, and now, without it, she felt lost, like a ship adrift in an endless sea. One evening, as she sorted through old papers, Eleanor stumbled upon a letter, a heartfelt note from Daniel's father, Mr. Grantham Sr., written years ago after she'd helped save a major project. The letter praised her commitment and integrity, calling her the heart of Grantham Industries. She clutched it close, tears streaming down her face, the words a bittersweet reminder of the respect she had once known. She missed him, the way he had valued her, not just as an employee but as a person. And she wondered if his son would ever understand what true loyalty meant. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his plans, but he found himself facing unexpected challenges. The team seemed less motivated, morale was low, and projects began to face delays. He was puzzled, frustrated, wondering why things weren't falling into place. Despite his best efforts, something essential was missing. And though he couldn't quite identify it, a nagging thought kept surfacing in his mind, a vague, unsettling sense that perhaps, in his quest for progress, he had overlooked something or someone irreplaceable. In the weeks following her departure from Grantham Industries, Eleanor's life fell into a monotonous rhythm, a stark contrast to the purposeful days she'd once known. Each morning, she awoke with a start, instinctively reaching for her work clothes, only to remember that she had nowhere to go. Her home, once a cozy haven after long workdays, felt hollow and unfamiliar without the routine she'd known for so many years. She'd dedicated nearly her entire life to that company, and the abrupt end had left her unanchored, adrift in her own sorrow. Eleanor's friendships, too, had been built around the company. She had been the one her co-workers confided in, the person who knew everyone's birthdays, who brought cakes for anniversaries and quietly encouraged people when they faced hard times. But now, without daily interactions, those friendships felt distant, as though her former colleagues had already moved on. Calls and messages were few and far between, each one a reminder of how easily people moved on, of how she was now merely a memory, a former employee with little impact on their lives. Financial worry began to weigh on her. Eleanor had always lived modestly, never considering retirement or what would happen if she couldn't work. She had imagined herself at Grantham Industries until her last breath, leaving only when she physically could no longer work. But now, at 74, job prospects were grim. Employers were hesitant to hire someone her age, and the interviews she did manage to secure ended quickly with polite smiles and vague reassurances that they'd keep her on file. Each rejection deepened her despair, the world feeling colder and less forgiving with every passing day. Bills piled up on her kitchen table, each one adding to the knot of worry that had settled in her stomach. Eleanor wasn't one to ask for help, she'd always prided herself on her independence, but now, that pride felt more like a heavy burden. Her small savings dwindled faster than she'd anticipated, and she was forced to make difficult choices, cutting back on essentials, living in constant anxiety over her dwindling resources. She was no longer the independent, capable woman she'd once seen herself as. Instead, she felt vulnerable, stripped of both purpose and stability. Loneliness became her constant companion, filling the spaces where laughter and conversation had once been. In an effort to fill the hours, she began volunteering at a nearby community center, hoping to find a semblance of purpose there. But even that offered little solace. The people she helped were appreciative, but they were strangers, unfamiliar with the story of her life, her years of dedication, her dreams. She longed to feel useful, to have someone look at her and see her worth, but each day only seemed to highlight how invisible she had become. One cold evening, as Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, sorting through old paperwork, she found herself holding the letter from Mr. Grantham Sr. once again. The words, full of genuine admiration and gratitude, felt like relics of a forgotten time, a moment when her worth had been unquestioned. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, imagining his warm smile, the way he had spoken to her with respect, as if her contributions truly mattered. She missed that feeling, the sense that she was part of something meaningful, and her heart ached with the knowledge that those days were gone. Meanwhile, Daniel was entirely unaware of the impact of his decision. He continued his relentless push for efficiency, restructuring departments, and implementing policies that he believed would lead the company into the future. But something was amiss. Employee morale was low, and productivity had started to decline. The team seemed distant, less invested, and although he held countless meetings to address the issue, the enthusiasm he sought was missing. Frustrated, he chalked it up to resistance to change, never once considering that Eleanor's departure had left a gap no one could fill. Daniel's assistant, a young woman named Claire, noticed the shift as well. She had admired Eleanor, finding comfort in her quiet strength and steady kindness. Now, she noticed the office felt colder, that people were more tense, less supportive of one another. She missed Eleanor's presence, the way she had always seemed to know when someone needed encouragement or help. She thought of mentioning this to Daniel but hesitated, knowing he wouldn't likely care about something as intangible as atmosphere. To him, results were everything, and Eleanor had been nothing more than a line item to cross off. Eleanor's absence began to have ripple effects that no one could have foreseen. Departments struggled with tasks she had handled seamlessly, clients noticed the lack of personal care she had brought to her work, and employees felt less seen, less valued without her quiet presence. But the changes were subtle, slow, and went largely unnoticed by Daniel, who was too focused on pushing the company forward to reflect on what might be holding it back. He was confident in his vision, certain that the setbacks were temporary, even if his employees silently began to question his decisions. Back at home, Eleanor's nights were restless, filled with thoughts of the life she'd left behind. She replayed her last day over and over, hearing Daniel's words echo in her mind, the coldness in his tone a painful contrast to the warmth she had known under his father's leadership. She wondered if he would ever understand what he had taken from her, if he would ever see her as more than just an old woman past her prime. And as she lay awake, her heart heavy with grief and uncertainty, she felt as though the world she had known had crumbled, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. Eleanor's routine of quiet loneliness and financial worry took a darker turn one late autumn evening. As she shuffled through her living room, sorting through the last of her bills, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She paused, clutching her heart, hoping it would pass, but the pain intensified, radiating down her arm. Panic surged through her as she realized something was very wrong. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, dialing for emergency help, her voice weak and breathless as she relayed her address. The ambulance arrived quickly, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow through her windows. Neighbors peered out, concerned, as the paramedics lifted Eleanor onto a stretcher. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind foggy, images of her life flashing through her head. She thought of her years at Grantham Industries, of the countless hours she'd spent caring for others, of the pride she had felt in her work. And, most painfully, she thought of the hollow space that had replaced it all, a void that had drained her spirit. Eleanor awoke hours later in a sterile hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights piercing her eyes. She felt weak, her body heavy, as though even lifting her head would take all the strength she had left. A doctor soon arrived, explaining that she had suffered a mild heart attack, likely brought on by prolonged stress and anxiety. He spoke gently, but his words filled her with dread. "You need to rest, Eleanor. At your age, recovery will take time, and you'll need help with daily tasks. Is there anyone we should call?" She shook her head slowly, feeling the weight of loneliness settle over her once more. The truth was, she had no close family left, and her friends from work had become distant. She realized, with a painful clarity, that she would have to face this alone. The doctor's face softened, and he suggested social services to help arrange in-home assistance, but Eleanor felt a deep shame at the thought. She had always prided herself on her independence, yet here she was, at her lowest, completely reliant on the kindness of strangers. Days passed in the hospital, each one a test of her patience and resilience. Nurses came and went, offering her food she barely touched, encouraging her to move, to regain her strength. But Eleanor's spirit felt shattered. Every moment alone in that stark room reminded her of the life she had lost, the purpose that had given her a reason to get up every morning. Her recovery felt agonizingly slow, each small movement a reminder of her fragility. The once strong, dependable woman she had been now felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone she barely recognized. As the doctors monitored her progress, Eleanor learned she would be discharged soon, though she was far from fully recovered. She would need continued care at home, they explained, urging her to rest and avoid stress. But she wondered how she would manage alone, her limited savings already stretched thin. The thought of facing her empty home, of struggling through each day without a soul to lean on, filled her with a sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable. Yet, she didn't voice her fears, keeping them buried beneath a polite nod and a hollow smile. Meanwhile, Daniel remained oblivious to Eleanor's suffering. His life was consumed by meetings and deadlines, his focus solely on the future of Grantham Industries. Employee morale continued to decline, productivity wavered, and clients grew increasingly frustrated. Despite his attempts to address these issues, he found himself met with resistance and reluctance from his team. "Why can't they understand this is for the best?" he muttered to himself, frustrated by what he saw as their inability to keep pace with his vision. As Eleanor prepared for her discharge, the social worker assigned to her case visited, explaining the resources available. But each option, Meals on Wheels, in-home assistance, felt like a blow to her pride. She struggled to accept that this was her reality, that her independence was slipping further out of reach with each passing day. She thanked the social worker, her voice barely above a whisper, feeling the sting of humiliation and vulnerability. She was used to being the one who helped others, yet here she was, a woman once proud and capable, now reliant on others. Eleanor returned home, her body weak and her heart heavy, each step reminding her of her limitations. Simple tasks, preparing a meal, climbing the stairs, were exhausting, leaving her feeling like a stranger in her own home. The solitude pressed in on her, amplifying her despair. She missed the warmth of her daily interactions, the purpose that had filled her life at Grantham Industries. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, each silent room a reminder of the life she had lost. In the days that followed, Eleanor's health continued to waver. She found herself questioning her own worth, wondering if her years of loyalty had truly meant anything at all. The emptiness that had filled her heart after her dismissal now felt unbearable, her life reduced to a series of small, insignificant tasks. Each day blurred into the next, her loneliness growing with every passing hour, as though the very walls around her were closing in, trapping her in a life that had become a shadow of what it once was. Eleanor's days at home passed in a haze of quiet suffering. Each morning, she awoke in the dark, listening to the silence of her small house, the ticking clock the only sound in the oppressive stillness. Tasks that had once seemed second nature, making tea, tidying the house, now felt insurmountable. Her body was frail, her movement slow, and every action reminded her of how much she had lost, both physically and emotionally. The sense of isolation weighed down on her like a heavy shroud, wrapping her in a darkness she couldn't escape. Bills continued to pile up on her kitchen table, each one a reminder of her vulnerability. She carefully budgeted what little money she had left, knowing her savings wouldn't last. Her life had always been simple, her needs modest, but now each expense was a painful reminder of her dependence. She wanted to reach out, to call someone, but the thought of burdening others, of showing the depth of her struggle, stopped her every time. She felt invisible, as though the world had already moved on without her. One evening, as she sat in her small living room, she opened her old address book, flipping through names she hadn't thought of in years. Many of her friends had either moved away or were no longer around. She paused at the page with her former co-workers' numbers, running her fingers over the faded ink. They had been her family in a way, once. But after she left, not one of them had reached out. She closed the book with a heavy heart, feeling as though her past had dissolved, leaving her with little more than memories that now felt bitter and distant. Unable to bear the silence, Eleanor started to take short walks around her neighborhood, leaning on a cane to steady herself. The world outside felt different, busier, faster, full of strangers who passed her by without a second glance. The faces she saw were unfamiliar, and each step reminded her of her fading independence, her fragility. One rainy afternoon, as she walked along the sidewalk, she stumbled, her cane slipping on the wet pavement. She caught herself against a lamppost, her heart racing, but no one stopped to help. She felt the sting of shame, her face flushed with both anger and despair. Returning home that evening, soaked and exhausted, Eleanor collapsed into her armchair, her body trembling from both exertion and sorrow. She clutched her cane, gripping it tightly as if it were a lifeline, the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. She looked around her quiet home, every corner filled with memories of a life she once thought would never change. Now, it all felt foreign, as if she were a guest in her own life. The walls, the furniture, the photos, none of it felt like it belonged to her anymore. That night, Eleanor lay awake in bed, the weight of her loneliness pressing down on her. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling with memories of her years at Grantham Industries, of the pride she had felt each day she entered that building. She thought of Mr. Grantham Sr., of his kindness and the way he had valued her. She remembered the letter he had written to her, the words of gratitude and admiration. She reached for it now, the paper crinkling softly in her hands as she read the words again, her heart aching for the respect and purpose she had once known. Across town, Daniel remained oblivious, wrapped up in the challenges of running Grantham Industries. His vision for the company was ambitious, but progress was slower than he'd anticipated. Employee turnover had increased, and his management team struggled to meet deadlines. He noticed that people seemed distant, less willing to go the extra mile, and he chalked it up to resistance to change. Yet, a nagging feeling lingered, a sense that something essential was missing, a thread that held everything together. One morning, Daniel overheard his assistant, Claire, speaking with a colleague about Eleanor. "It's strange not having her here, isn't it?" Claire said softly. She was always the one who brought everyone together. Her colleague nodded, a wistful look in his eyes. "She was the heart of this place. I didn't realize how much we relied on her until she was gone." Their words stirred something in Daniel, a faint discomfort that he quickly brushed aside. Eleanor had been part of the old guard, a relic of his father's era. Surely, the company's struggles couldn't be tied to her absence. But as the weeks wore on, Daniel's frustration grew. Projects continued to stall, clients began voicing concerns, and the company's reputation seemed to be slipping. He spent long nights in his office, poring over reports, trying to pinpoint the source of the issues. Yet, for all his efforts, he felt as though he were chasing shadows, unable to grasp what was wrong. And in the quiet moments, he found himself thinking of Eleanor, of her calm presence, the way she had known everyone by name, her attention to details he had dismissed as unimportant. Eleanor's world, meanwhile, had grown even smaller. Her days were filled with silence, her strength waning as the weight of loneliness and despair took its toll. She clung to her memories, to the letters and mementos she had saved, each one a fragment of the life she had loved. But even those memories began to fade, slipping from her grasp as though they were part of a story that no longer belonged to her. And as winter settled in, her isolation deepened, each day a painful reminder of the life she had lost, and the world that had seemingly forgotten her. Winter's chill seeped into Eleanor's small home, amplifying the silence that filled every room. Her health continued to decline, each day a struggle as her body grew weaker. The heating bills alone strained her limited finances, forcing her to rely on a single blanket and layers of clothing to keep warm. She felt the cold not only in her bones but in her heart, as though life itself was slowly retreating from her. With each passing day, she felt herself slipping further into despair, her once strong spirit battered by the isolation and uncertainty of her situation. On one particularly frigid night, Eleanor lay awake, unable to sleep as the drafty air gnawed at her skin. Her stomach rumbled, but the thought of spending what little money she had left on groceries filled her with dread. She had cut down on everything, rationing even the most basic necessities. Her home, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt hostile, each creak and groan a reminder of how alone she truly was. She thought about reaching out to someone, anyone, but the thought of sharing her vulnerability, of showing how far she had fallen, kept her silent. The days became a blur, her strength dwindling as exhaustion and malnutrition took their toll. Eleanor's once bright eyes grew dull, her once steady hands now shook with weakness. She rarely left her bed, her energy spent simply on staying warm. Each small movement became an effort, every trip to the kitchen a task that felt insurmountable. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her bedroom, where the cold seeped through every crack and corner, pressing down on her like an unyielding weight. Her dreams became haunted by memories of the past, moments of joy and purpose that now felt like echoes from another life. One afternoon, after days of barely eating, Eleanor tried to make her way to the kitchen for a glass of water. She took slow, tentative steps, her cane wobbling under her weight. As she reached the doorway, her vision blurred, the room spinning around her. She gripped the doorframe, her breath shallow as she struggled to steady herself, but her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. The cold tiles pressed against her cheek, the chill seeping into her skin as she lay there, too weak to move. A quiet despair filled her, a realization that she might truly be alone, that help would not come. Hours passed before Eleanor found the strength to pull herself up, inch by inch, using the wall for support. She stumbled back to her bed, collapsing onto it as exhaustion overtook her. She felt as though her body were betraying her, as though each day brought her closer to a breaking point she could no longer avoid. Her mind drifted back to Grantham Industries, to the people she had once known, wondering if any of them even remembered her. The thought of Daniel, the man who had cast her aside so easily, filled her with a hollow sadness, a deep ache for the respect she had once felt. Across town, Daniel remained entrenched in his own struggles, oblivious to the extent of Eleanor's suffering. Grantham Industries was facing its worst quarter yet, and he felt the pressure mounting with every passing day. Deadlines slipped, productivity plummeted, and the atmosphere in the office grew tense. The passion he had once brought to his position was now overshadowed by frustration and fatigue. He found himself reflecting on the culture of the company, on the values his father had instilled. But to him, Eleanor was just part of a forgotten past, until something unexpected happened. One day, Daniel's assistant, Claire, left a file on his desk containing a letter. She had found it in the archives, an old note from his father to Eleanor, praising her dedication, loyalty, and the impact she had on the entire company. Reading his father's words, Daniel felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. He realized that his father had valued Eleanor deeply, that she had been more than just an employee. The words described her as the heart of Grantham Industries, a presence that brought warmth and humanity to the office. He couldn't ignore the subtle reminder of what had been lost. Daniel's mind wandered back to Eleanor, his thoughts plagued by the memory of her final days at the office. He remembered her quiet dignity, the way she had accepted her dismissal without argument, without bitterness. A flicker of guilt stirred within him, a growing awareness that, in his drive to modernize and streamline, he had overlooked something essential. He thought of his father's words, the respect and gratitude they conveyed, and he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The sense of unease that had been building within Daniel grew sharper, nagging at him with an intensity he couldn't shake. He began to realize that Eleanor's departure had not only affected her, it had affected the entire company. And now, with morale at an all-time low, productivity failing, and a revolving door of employees, he began to suspect that her absence was a part of the problem he had been trying so hard to solve. The thought unsettled him deeply, filling him with an uncomfortable sense of responsibility for the pain he might have caused. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He found himself reflecting on Eleanor's years of service, her dedication, and the legacy his father had built with people like her. He had taken her loyalty for granted, casting her aside without a second thought. Now, as he stared at the ceiling, the weight of his decisions pressed down on him, heavy and relentless. He knew he had to make things right. As winter continued its grip, Eleanor's health deteriorated further. The days blurred together, and she found herself confined almost entirely to her bed, her once simple routines now too physically demanding to manage. The heating in her home barely kept the cold at bay, and the few calls she received from social services were brief, offering only minimal assistance. Her spirit, already battered, grew weaker by the day. Her world was slipping away, and Eleanor felt as though she were dissolving into the silence, forgotten by everyone who once knew her. Then, late one night, as Eleanor lay half asleep, she was startled awake by a loud, insistent pounding on her front door. Confused and alarmed, she struggled to sit up, her heart racing. She wondered who would be at her door at such an hour, especially since she'd had no visitors in weeks. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but the pounding continued, a mixture of urgency and impatience in each thud. Gathering what little strength she had, she made her way slowly to the door, her body frail and unsteady. When she opened the door, a cold blast of air swept over her, and she found herself face to face with a man in a black coat, holding a clipboard. His expression was serious, his gaze cold and impersonal. "Mrs. Eleanor Miller?" he asked, his tone devoid of warmth. She nodded, clutching her thin sweater tightly around her. "I'm here on behalf of the mortgage company," he continued, his voice clipped and professional. "You're months behind on payments. I regret to inform you that, unless the outstanding balance is cleared immediately, we have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure." Eleanor's heart dropped. She had known she was behind on payments, of course, but she hadn't realized how dire the situation had become. The words felt like a punch, each one settling heavily in her chest. "But, this is my home. "I've lived here for nearly 40 years, she stammered, her voice weak and trembling. She explained, her words spilling out in desperation, how she had lost her job, how she tried to make ends meet, but her pleas were met with a stony silence. The man glanced at his clipboard again, unfazed by her story. "I'm sorry, he said, his tone unchanged. "But there are protocols we must follow. You have 30 days to settle the debt, or the property will be reclaimed." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing in the cold, her mind reeling. She closed the door, her body feeling heavier than it ever had before. The home she had poured her life into, filled with memories and cherished possessions, was now slipping away, just like everything else. The realization settled over her, sharp and painful, like a wound she couldn't heal. Eleanor spent that night in her armchair, too shaken to move. She thought of the years she had spent in that home, the laughter and love that had once filled its walls. The small garden she had tended, the cozy kitchen where she had prepared countless meals, every corner of the house held a piece of her life, a reminder of who she once was. Losing it felt like losing herself entirely, a final blow that left her feeling hollow and defeated. She had nowhere else to go, no family to turn to, and the thought of ending up homeless was a terror she hadn't imagined possible. In the days that followed, Eleanor tried to come up with a plan, but her options were limited. Her strength was failing, her finances were depleted, and the reality of her situation loomed over her like a dark cloud. She considered selling her belongings, but even that would only cover a fraction of the debt. Each attempt to find a solution led her back to the same inescapable conclusion: she was at the end of her rope, with no one left to help her. The isolation, once merely painful, now felt like a slow descent into despair. Across town, Daniel remained unaware of Eleanor's dire circumstances, his life consumed by the ongoing challenges at Grantham Industries. Yet, the unease he had felt after reading his father's letter lingered, and he found himself questioning his choices more often. In quiet moments, he would think of Eleanor, wondering if he had misjudged her, if he had dismissed someone who had been, in his father's words, the heart of the company. But he brushed the thought aside, convinced that his business decisions were justified, that Eleanor was simply part of the past. As the 30-day deadline drew closer, Eleanor's health worsened under the strain of stress and malnutrition. Each night, she lay awake, haunted by memories of Grantham Industries, of a time when she had felt valued and purposeful. She thought of reaching out, of calling the company to explain her situation, but shame held her back. She couldn't bring herself to ask for help, not after the way she had been cast aside. She felt as though she were disappearing, each day erasing another piece of her, until there was nothing left. Then, just as hope seemed beyond reach, she received a notice in the mail, a final warning from the bank, giving her 10 days to vacate the property if the balance was not cleared. The words blurred before her eyes as tears spilled down her cheeks. She was losing everything: her home, her history, her very sense of self. With trembling hands, she placed the notice on the table, her heart breaking as she faced the reality of her situation. She would soon be homeless, cast into a world that had shown her nothing but indifference. In a final act of desperation, Eleanor decided to pack a small bag, taking only her most treasured items: the letter from Mr. Grantham Sr., a photograph of her younger self, and a few personal mementos. As she placed them carefully in the bag, she felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. She took one last look around her home, her gaze lingering on the walls that had held her life, her memories, her dreams. And with a deep, shuddering breath, she prepared herself for what lay ahead, facing the unknown with a heart heavy and broken, yet filled with a quiet resilience that would carry her forward. On the morning of her final eviction notice, Eleanor walked through her nearly empty house, saying silent goodbyes to each room. The walls, bare and unadorned, echoed back memories she had stored within them. She moved slowly, her footsteps soft and hesitant, as though each step might erase another piece of her past. Her heart felt like it was breaking, piece by piece, but she held herself together, determined to leave with dignity, even if she had little else left. Her health had worsened significantly over the past few days, a result of both malnutrition and stress, and she struggled to even stand at times. She had barely eaten, rationing her meager supplies, and the strain showed in her weakened frame. She thought about calling someone for help, but each time, shame stopped her. The thought of anyone seeing her like this, frail, vulnerable, and homeless, was unbearable. She felt trapped by her pride, clinging to the last shred of dignity she had. Eleanor left the house in the early hours, carrying only a small bag with her most cherished belongings, the letter from Mr. Grantham Sr., a few photos, and a worn but treasured keepsake from her mother. As she stepped outside, the winter air stung her face, biting at her skin and amplifying the chill that had already settled into her bones. She clutched her bag tightly, shivering as she walked away from the home she had loved for so long, her heart heavy with grief and loss. She didn't know where she would go, only that she had nowhere else left. For hours, Eleanor wandered the streets in a daze, barely noticing the world around her. She felt invisible, like a ghost drifting through the city, unseen and unheard. People passed her by without a second glance, their faces turned away as though her presence was something to be ignored. She made her way to a nearby park and found an empty bench, lowering herself onto it carefully. The weight of exhaustion and despair pressed down on her, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She closed her eyes, her thoughts swirling in a fog of fatigue and sorrow. As the hours passed, the cold seeped deeper into her, her body too weak to keep itself warm. She tried to pull her thin coat tighter, but it did little to stave off the chill. She thought of all she had lost, her job, her home, her sense of belonging. A deep sadness filled her, a sorrow that seemed to sink into her very bones. She had always been someone who took pride in her independence, her strength, but now, she felt completely and utterly broken, a shell of the person she had once been. Across town, Daniel was in his office, sifting through a pile of reports when he felt an odd pang of restlessness. He had been having trouble sleeping, and his mind kept drifting back to Eleanor, to the old letter from his father he'd found. He couldn't shake the sense of guilt that lingered, an uncomfortable awareness that he might have misjudged her, that he had taken something irreplaceable from her life. With a deep sigh, he picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Claire, can you find Eleanor Miller's contact information for me?" he asked, a sense of urgency in his voice. Claire paused, surprised. "Eleanor? I can look into it, but, well, she hasn't been in touch since she left." She hesitated, her voice softening. "To be honest, sir, I heard she's not doing well. Some of the older staff mentioned she's been struggling." Daniel's chest tightened. He knew he'd made a harsh decision, but he hadn't thought much about the consequences beyond his vision for the company. The realization that Eleanor, a woman who had devoted decades to Grantham Industries, was suffering hit him harder than he expected. Fueled by an impulse he couldn't explain, Daniel decided to go out and search for Eleanor himself. He wasn't even sure where to start, but he knew he had to try. He left the office and drove through the streets, scanning the sidewalks and parks for any sign of her. It was a long shot, he knew, but something compelled him forward, a nagging sense that he needed to make amends, to see for himself the impact of his decisions. He drove past blocks of empty streets, each turn only heightening his worry. As evening approached, he finally spotted a figure sitting on a bench in a nearby park, huddled and frail. His heart pounded as he pulled over, realizing with a jolt that it was Eleanor. She sat motionless, her eyes closed, her face pale and worn. Daniel approached slowly, overcome by the sight of her, the reality of her suffering a sharp contrast to the memory of the steady, reliable woman he had known. He felt a pang of guilt so deep that he had to steady himself, forcing himself to face the consequences of his actions. "Eleanor," he called softly, his voice barely a whisper. She stirred, opening her eyes slowly, her gaze unfocused and weary. When she recognized him, a mixture of surprise and sorrow crossed her face. She looked away, as though ashamed, too broken to meet his gaze. What are you doing here, Mr. Grantham?" she murmured, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and something more, a bitterness he hadn't expected. Daniel knelt beside her, his heart heavy. "Eleanor, I didn't know," he began, struggling to find the right words. He saw now how deeply his decision had affected her, the toll it had taken on her health, her life. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and he felt an overwhelming urge to make things right, though he knew it might be too late. "Please, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice thick with regret. "Let me help you. Let me make this right." But in her eyes, he saw a pain that couldn't be so easily erased. Eleanor looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The cold had seeped so deeply into her bones that even her voice seemed brittle as she spoke. "Help me," she repeated, a faint tremor in her words. "You took everything, Mr. Grantham. My job, my home, my dignity. And now, when there's nothing left, you want to help." She turned her gaze away, her face etched with exhaustion and pain. Her fingers clutched her thin coat tighter around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the man who had become the source of her suffering. Daniel took a slow breath, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He hadn't imagined his decision would unravel her life like this, hadn't thought that a single choice in the boardroom would lead her here, huddled and homeless on a freezing bench. For the first time, he saw Eleanor not as an employee, but as a person, a life he had impacted profoundly. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong. I didn't see. I didn't understand what you meant to this company, what you meant to so many people. To me." Eleanor's expression softened, but her distrust remained. Years of dedication couldn't be so easily dismissed, nor could her wounds heal overnight. She looked at him, searching his face, as if trying to see if his words held any true remorse. "Mr. Grantham," she began, her voice stronger, more resolute. "I gave you my life, my loyalty, without expecting anything in return. And yet, you threw me away as though I were nothing. Now, here I am, at my lowest. Can you see what that feels like? To be invisible, forgotten?" Daniel swallowed, her words piercing him more deeply than he could have expected. He had always prided himself on his decisiveness, on making hard choices for the greater good of the company. But in Eleanor's gaze, he saw the faces of his employees, the people he'd overlooked, the sacrifices he had disregarded in his pursuit of progress. A wave of shame washed over him. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "Eleanor, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, let me help you now. Let me try to make things right. At least, let me give you the respect I should have shown from the beginning." For a long moment, Eleanor remained silent, her breath shallow, the faint fog of winter escaping her lips. The bitterness that had settled within her heart softened just slightly as she looked at him, his eyes filled with a sorrow she hadn't seen before. A part of her longed to reject his offer, to shield herself from further disappointment. But there was also a glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent, that he truly understood the gravity of what he had done. She nodded slowly, her eyes still wary but open to the possibility of change. Daniel immediately extended his hand, guiding her to her feet, his movements gentle and cautious. Eleanor could feel his support, his steady grip grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in months. They walked slowly back to his car, each step a painful reminder of her weakened state. She leaned on him, accepting his help, though the weight of her struggles remained heavy. Daniel opened the car door, helping her inside with a gentleness that surprised her, and as she settled into the warmth of the vehicle, she felt the numbness in her hands and feet start to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. On the drive back, Daniel kept glancing over at her, his mind racing with questions and regrets. He wanted to ask about her life, to understand what she had endured, but he feared that his questions would only deepen her wounds. Instead, he focused on what he could do for her now. "I have a place you can stay, Eleanor," he said quietly. "One of the company's guest apartments, it's warm, and it's yours for as long as you need. And I want to make sure you're taken care of, financially and medically." Eleanor listened, her gaze fixed out the window, watching the city lights blur past. She wanted to believe him, to let herself feel gratitude, but the scars of his decisions still lingered, raw and fresh. "I don't need charity, Mr. Grantham," she replied, her tone firm yet wary. "I need dignity. I need to be seen, respected. And I need to feel like I still have worth." Her voice trembled slightly, the pain of her ordeal woven through each word. She had lost so much more than a job. She had lost the very core of her identity. Daniel nodded, understanding her words in a way he hadn't before. "Then I'll make sure you're not forgotten again," he said, his voice steady. "I can't undo what I did, but I can start by acknowledging what you gave to this company. And what you gave to me." He tightened his grip on the wheel, determined to prove to her, and to himself, that he could be different, that he could do better. He felt a resolve harden within him, a commitment not just to help her recover, but to honor her legacy and restore the dignity he had taken from her. They arrived at the guest apartment, and Daniel helped Eleanor inside, guiding her to the warmth and comfort she had been without for so long. She took in the space, simple but inviting, the soft lighting casting a glow that felt like a balm to her spirit. As she sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally caught up with her, her body succumbing to the comfort and warmth. Daniel stood quietly by the door, watching as her defenses began to lower, her face softening as she allowed herself, just for a moment, to rest. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible, but filled with a quiet sincerity. She looked up at him, her gaze still guarded, but with a glimmer of trust. It was the first step toward healing, both for Eleanor and for Daniel, who now understood the gravity of his actions in a way he never had before. He left her that night, promising to return in the morning with warm clothes, food, and anything else she might need. And as he walked away, he felt a weight lift from him, a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. In the silence of the apartment, Eleanor felt a cautious warmth settle over her. She was not healed, nor was her trust in Daniel fully restored. But she felt a spark of hope, faint but real, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim the life and dignity that had been taken from her. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the unfamiliar comfort of a soft bed and warm blankets. For a moment, she lay still, taking in the gentle warmth and quiet peace of the apartment. The memories of the previous day came flooding back, Daniel finding her in the park, his offer of help, and his unexpected remorse. She still wasn't sure how to feel about him, but as she looked around the room, she allowed herself a sliver of gratitude for the chance to feel safe again, even if only for now. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she slowly made her way to the door. When she opened it, she found Daniel standing there, holding a few bags filled with groceries, warm clothes, and a few essentials. He looked at her with an expression that mixed both relief and regret, his usual confidence softened by something more genuine. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said gently, handing her a bag. "I brought some things you might need, and I'd like to help with whatever else you need going forward. This place is yours for as long as you want it." Eleanor accepted the bags, her fingers brushing his briefly before she stepped back, allowing him inside. She set the bags on the small dining table, taking her time as she unpacked them: fruit, vegetables, soups, a warm scarf, and a cozy sweater. Each item felt like a reminder of her losses but also of her fragile hope for recovery. Daniel watched her silently, his gaze reflecting a quiet apology he hadn't yet voiced. "Thank you," she murmured, barely looking up. The words felt strange on her lips, almost too forgiving, but she couldn't deny the comfort his efforts brought. Daniel took a seat across from her, gathering his thoughts. He knew he couldn't undo the months of hardship she had faced, but he was determined to try to bridge the gap his actions had created. "Eleanor," he began, his voice quiet, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I've done, about the decision I made without understanding what you meant to Grantham Industries, or to my father." He looked at her, his eyes filled with an earnestness she hadn't seen before. "I was wrong to dismiss you. And I want to make sure you know that your work mattered, that you mattered." Eleanor held his gaze, her eyes flickering with a mixture of disbelief and guarded hope. She had waited for someone, anyone, to acknowledge her worth, to tell her that her years of dedication had not been for nothing. And now, as she sat across from the man who had taken everything from her, she felt the first glimmer of validation she had longed for. "It's one thing to say that now, Mr. Grantham," she replied, her voice steady. "But words are hollow without action. Respect isn't just spoken, it's shown, through choices and values." Her words hung heavy in the room, and Daniel felt the weight of them settle into his chest. He realized that her trust, fragile as it was, would not be won with apologies alone. "You're right, Eleanor," he said, nodding. "And I want to do more than apologize. I'd like to reinstate you at Grantham Industries, if you're willing. You would have your old position back, or any role you prefer. And this time, it will be on your terms." The offer was sincere, his voice filled with a humility she hadn't expected. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. She hadn't imagined this, returning to the place that had once been her life, her family. She looked away, her mind racing with a blend of emotions. The thought of walking back through those doors was both comforting and terrifying. She wanted to feel the sense of purpose again, to reclaim her dignity, but fear lingered in her heart. "Going back," she whispered, her voice trailing off. "I don't know if it would ever feel the same." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "It won't be the same, Eleanor, because I've changed, and I intend to change the company too. We've lost something irreplaceable since you left, and I'm starting to understand that. You taught me something important, even if I didn't realize it at the time. And I want you to be part of shaping the future of Grantham Industries." His words were genuine, filled with the weight of his newfound understanding. She could see his remorse and the conviction in his eyes, a sincerity that she hadn't seen before. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the layers of hurt and distrust begin to soften, though they hadn't fully healed. The idea of returning was daunting, yet the thought of reclaiming her place, her purpose, stirred something deep within her. "I'll think about it," she said softly, her voice filled with caution. "But if I do come back, it has to be on my terms, with respect, not just for me, but for every person who's given their life to that company." Her words were firm, a quiet reminder that her forgiveness would not come easily. Daniel nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Of course," he replied, his voice gentle. "And, Eleanor, I want to be clear, this isn't just about fixing my mistakes. I want you to know that I truly respect you. Your loyalty, your dedication, they've taught me more than any business lesson ever could." The vulnerability in his voice surprised her, and for the first time, she felt a cautious willingness to believe him, to consider that maybe, just maybe, he had changed. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the conversation's weight. Eleanor's heart felt lighter than it had in months, a tiny flicker of hope warming her from within. She looked around the small apartment, feeling a gratitude that went beyond comfort. This was her chance to rebuild, to regain the respect she had lost, and perhaps even to forgive the man sitting across from her. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. Grantham," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I hope you understand that if I come back, it's to change things, not to return to the past." Daniel's face broke into a small, genuine smile, a glimmer of relief and admiration shining in his eyes. "I wouldn't want it any other way, Eleanor," he replied, his tone filled with resolve. And as he looked at her, he realized that this was the beginning of a transformation, not just for Eleanor, but for Grantham Industries, and for himself. The day Eleanor decided to return to Grantham Industries was bright, the winter's chills softened by the warmth of the sun. She stood outside the building, her breath visible in the cold air, feeling both the weight of her memories and the promise of a fresh start. Daniel had kept his word, meeting her here to personally welcome her back. He approached with a respectful nod, his face marked by humility and a genuine gratitude that surprised her. "Welcome home, Eleanor," he said quietly, and for the first time, she believed him. As they entered the lobby, Eleanor felt a rush of emotions: fear, pride, relief, and an undeniable sense of belonging. The once familiar faces of colleagues lit up with surprise and joy as they saw her. Some even came over to greet her, their voices filled with warmth as they welcomed her back. Her heart swelled with each smile, each whispered, "It's so good to see you again." Eleanor had spent months feeling invisible, discarded, and now, here she was, surrounded by people who valued her, who understood the legacy she had built within these walls. Daniel led her to a new office, far more spacious and prominent than her previous one. The view overlooked the city skyline, the bright morning light casting a soft glow on the polished desk, fresh flowers, and an engraved nameplate that read, Eleanor Miller, Senior Advisor. She looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief. Senior Advisor, she whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the plaque. Daniel nodded, his face earnest. You deserve more than to pick up where you left off. Your experience and dedication are irreplaceable, Eleanor. I need your guidance to help shape this company's future. Overwhelmed, Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. This was more than she had ever hoped for, more than she thought possible. She had returned, not as a symbol of the past, but as a respected force, someone with a voice, someone who mattered. She remembered the long nights of despair, the fear that her life had lost its purpose, and now, here she stood, reclaimed by the company that had once turned its back on her. She was no longer invisible. Her contributions were seen, acknowledged, and honored. As the day unfolded, Eleanor became reacquainted with her responsibilities, reviewing reports and consulting with various departments. Employees approached her not only with questions but with genuine respect, eager for her insight. She felt the quiet confidence returning, the sense of purpose that had once defined her. Every task, every conversation reinforced that she was not only welcome but needed. Her experience was no longer dismissed as outdated but celebrated as wisdom, and it was as though each part of her that had been broken was now being mended. Throughout the day, Daniel made a point of involving her in high-level meetings, introducing her as a trusted advisor and mentor. His shift in demeanor was clear to everyone. He listened more, his approach softened, and he actively sought her input. Eleanor could see the ripple effects of his transformation, a newfound respect for the people he led. She watched as he acknowledged team members' contributions, his gratitude genuine, his humility hard-won. The company culture began to reflect this change, an environment where loyalty and dedication were recognized and valued. Then, toward the end of the day, Daniel called a company-wide meeting in the conference hall, inviting Eleanor to join him at the front. She felt a flutter of nerves but walked beside him, her head held high. As they stood together, he addressed the room. I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who has given more to this company than I had ever realized, he began, his voice steady. Eleanor Miller dedicated decades of her life to Grantham Industries, not just as an employee, but as the heart and soul of our team. In my short-sightedness, I failed to see her value. And today, I want to make amends. The room fell silent, every eye focused on Eleanor, their expressions a mix of admiration and respect. Daniel continued, Eleanor's commitment and wisdom are irreplaceable, and it's because of her that I've realized how essential every person is to our success. Today, I'm proud to announce that Eleanor has been appointed as Senior Advisor, guiding us forward with her insight and experience. The applause that followed filled the room, and Eleanor, overwhelmed by the show of appreciation, felt tears slip down her cheeks. After the meeting, employees approached her, each handshake and kind word a balm to her soul. They thanked her for her years of guidance, for the quiet kindnesses she had shown, and for the sense of community she had built within the company. One young employee even told her, Eleanor, you're why I stayed. Your presence made this place feel like home. She could barely speak, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. For the first time in months, she felt truly whole. Later that evening, as Eleanor returned to her apartment, she paused to reflect on her journey. She had endured hardship, suffering, and loss, only to come full circle, stronger and more respected than ever. She had regained not only her position but her dignity and self-worth. She realized that her resilience had been her greatest asset, carrying her through the darkest moments. This was her reward, not just a title or an office, but a place where she was valued, where her legacy would continue. Daniel visited her that night to check in, bringing with him a small gift, a beautifully framed letter from his father, one she had never seen before. It was filled with words of admiration and gratitude, praising her as the true heart of Grantham Industries. She read it, her hands trembling, feeling the full impact of his father's respect. "This is yours, Eleanor," Daniel said softly. "It always has been." She looked at him, her heart filled with forgiveness and peace, and for the first time in years, she truly felt at home. As the weeks passed, the changes at Grantham Industries became undeniable, but none were as profound as the transformation within Daniel himself. He found himself spending more time with Eleanor, seeking her guidance on decisions he once would have made on impulse. He watched her, admiring her quiet strength and the grace with which she carried herself, even after everything she'd endured. There was a deep respect for her that he hadn't felt before, respect not only for her work but for her resilience, her ability to forgive even after the hardship she had faced. But with every moment of growth, Daniel also felt the sting of regret for what he had put her through. The memory of finding her in the park, shivering and alone, haunted him in quiet moments, a reminder of his carelessness and the pain he had caused. He couldn't forget the hollow look in her eyes when she'd first seen him there, a look that had shown him the depths of her suffering. Each day, he found himself grappling with the knowledge that his pursuit of success had nearly destroyed a life. The weight of that truth hung over him, heavy and unyielding. Late one evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, a single lamp casting a warm glow across the room. He looked down at the reports, the graphs showing the company's steady improvement since Eleanor's return. Yet, even with the company thriving, he felt a hollowness inside, as though his accomplishments were overshadowed by the mistakes that had brought him to this point. He wanted to move on, to accept the progress he had made, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's face in that cold park, the shame of his actions echoing in his mind. In those quiet hours, he realized how much he had sacrificed in his single-minded ambition to transform Grantham Industries. He had let go of values his father had instilled in him, the principles of loyalty, humility, and compassion. His father had once told him that a true leader was not measured by profit but by the lives he impacted, the trust he fostered, and the respect he earned. Daniel now understood those words in a way he hadn't before, and he could see, with painful clarity, how far he had strayed from that ideal. Eleanor's forgiveness had been an unexpected gift, and yet it was one he struggled to accept. She had extended him a kindness he felt he didn't deserve, and each time he saw her in the halls, smiling or offering advice, it was as though she were holding up a mirror to the man he had once been, the man he was determined to leave behind. He knew he had to let go of the guilt, to forgive himself for his past mistakes if he ever hoped to lead the company with the integrity his father had envisioned. But the path to self-forgiveness was fraught with self-doubt and remorse. One afternoon, he joined Eleanor in the break room, where she was making tea. She looked up, her gaze warm and welcoming, as though they hadn't shared a painful history but rather a friendship born from understanding. "Daniel," she began, sensing his unease, "you don't need to carry this burden alone." Her words were gentle, offering him a grace he hadn't yet given himself. He wanted to open up, to tell her about the weight he felt, but he hesitated, unsure of where to begin. "Eleanor, I still feel the shame of what I did," he finally admitted, his voice quiet. "You forgave me, but I don't know if I can forgive myself." His words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw, and Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm, grounding him with her steady presence. "Sometimes, Daniel, the hardest person to forgive is ourselves," she replied softly. "But holding on to that guilt won't undo the past. You've changed, and that's what matters. Carry that forward." Her words struck something deep within him, her kindness both a balm and a challenge. He realized that, while he had sought her forgiveness, he hadn't yet accepted the responsibility of living up to it. Forgiveness, he understood now, was not simply an erasure of mistakes but an invitation to live differently. It required him to honor her trust, to build something meaningful from the lessons he had learned, to ensure that his mistakes would not define him but instead drive him to be a better man. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office, reflecting on the journey he had taken. He took out his father's letter to Eleanor, reading the words of admiration and respect. He saw his father's vision, his deep commitment to the people who had built Grantham Industries alongside him. His father's words had described Eleanor as the heart of the company, and Daniel finally understood what that truly meant. It wasn't just about loyalty, it was about valuing every person, seeing their worth beyond profit and productivity, recognizing the humanity that made them essential. As he put the letter away, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He knew he would never forget the mistakes he had made, but he could use them as a guide, a reminder of the path he needed to take. He could make amends, not by dwelling on the past, but by creating a future built on trust, respect, and compassion. The day was calm, the late winter sun casting a soft glow through the windows of Grantham Industries as Daniel stood by his office window, taking in the quiet hum of the company he had nearly lost to his own ambition. He breathed in deeply, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. Eleanor's return had not only revitalized the company but had given him a second chance, a chance to lead with the integrity his father had believed in. It was a gift he would no longer take for granted. Across the hall, Eleanor was organizing a small meeting with new employees. Her voice carried through the office, warm and steady, as she shared her years of wisdom, guiding them in a way that inspired confidence. Daniel listened from afar, a small smile on his face as he recognized the respect she commanded, the quiet leadership that had been her strength all along. She had become not just a senior advisor, but a mentor to everyone around her, embodying the compassion and dedication that he now understood to be the foundation of his father's legacy. That afternoon, Daniel called a company-wide gathering. As employees filled the conference room, murmurs of curiosity echoed through the crowd. He stood at the front, his gaze steady as he looked out at the faces before him, people he had once overlooked, people he now saw as the heart of Grantham Industries. Eleanor took her place by his side, her presence a grounding force, her smile one of encouragement. For a moment, he felt the familiar pang of regret, but he steadied himself, ready to speak from the new place of humility and resolve he had found. "I want to thank all of you," he began, his voice clear but filled with a quiet vulnerability. "These past months have taught me more than any business lesson ever could. I came into this role focused on numbers and efficiency, but I lost sight of what truly matters, the people who make this company what it is." He glanced at Eleanor, his expression softening with gratitude. "Eleanor Miller showed me what true leadership looks like. Her resilience, her loyalty, her compassion are what define Grantham Industries. And because of her, I understand the kind of leader I need to become." A ripple of applause swept through the room, employees nodding and exchanging warm glances. Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest, a sense of release from the mistakes he had carried. For the first time, he could look at his past without the sting of shame, seeing it instead as the path that had brought him to this moment. He looked back at Eleanor, whose eyes shone with pride, not only for him but for the changes they had both helped bring to the company. She gave him a slight nod, as if to say, "You're ready." After the meeting, as the employees dispersed, Daniel found Eleanor waiting by the door. He walked over to her, the gratitude in his heart almost too large to contain. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I don't think I could ever thank you enough for what you've given me, not just for forgiving me, but for helping me find the strength to forgive myself." She looked at him, her gaze warm and steady, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Thank yourself, Daniel. Growth isn't easy. But you're here now, and that's what counts." In the days that followed, Daniel began to implement changes inspired by Eleanor's vision and the lessons he had learned. Grantham Industries became a place where employees felt valued, where their contributions were celebrated. He introduced mentorship programs, wellness initiatives, and spaces for open communication, ensuring that every employee had a voice. And as the company grew, Daniel found that his relationships with his team became a source of pride and joy, a fulfillment he hadn't known he was missing. Eleanor continued to be the steady force guiding the company, her presence a reminder of the values they had all come to cherish. But she also took time to nurture her own life outside of work, reconnecting with old friends, volunteering in her community, and even finding hobbies she'd never had time for before. She had regained her purpose, but now it was balanced by a sense of freedom and joy she hadn't known in years. One evening, Daniel and Eleanor shared a quiet dinner to celebrate the company's progress. They spoke not of numbers or strategies but of life, of resilience, of the shared journey that had changed them both. As they laughed over old stories and spoke of future dreams, Daniel felt a peace settle within him, a sense that he had finally honored his father's legacy and that he was ready to carry it forward with purpose and heart. Before parting, Daniel raised a toast. "To second chances," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Eleanor raised her glass, her eyes shining with warmth. "And to the wisdom we find along the way," she added softly. They clinked glasses, each of them holding a new understanding of strength, humility, and forgiveness. As Daniel watched Eleanor walk away that night, he felt a profound sense of closure. The weight of his past mistakes had lifted, replaced by a commitment to lead with empathy and respect. And for the first time in his life, he knew he had truly earned his place, not only as the CEO of Grantham Industries, but as the man his father had always hoped he would become. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.